Hello everyone. Welcome to Research and Language Learning Series, co-sponsored by Slavic Reference Service at the University of Illinois and Indiana University School of Global International Studies and Summer Language Workshop. My name is Olga Makarova. I'm a research specialist at the Slavic Reference Service, and it is my pleasure to introduce the Associate Professor at the Department of Central Eurasian Studies at the Indiana University, Dr. Marianne Kamp. Dr. Kamp is a social historian of modern Central Asia who uses oral history methods to explore transformations in everyday life during the Soviet period and since the independence, 1991. She is author of The New Woman in Uzbekistan, Islam, Modernity and Unveiling Under Communism, published in 2006, and also an edited translation with Marianne Markova, Muslim Women of the Russian Empire, Vladimir and Maria Nalivkin's 19th century Fergana Valley ethnography, published in 2016, and also numerous articles and chapters. She is currently working on a book about the collectivization of agriculture in 1930s Uzbekistan, and also serves as a book review editor for Central Asian Survey. Okay, you can probably update this. Today, Dr. Kamp will be talking to us about the role Uzbek language proficiency plays in her research and academic career. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to do a share screen. And so I'll probably mess this up the first time and then get it right after that or something. So please be patient with me for a second. Okay, I'm going to share. And then I am doing slideshow, and then I'm doing from beginning. Whoop. All right, and one more step. Okay, all right, I think I can handle this now. My name is Marianne Kamp, as Olga said, and I'll tell you a little bit about me. Actually, I'm an oral historian, and what oral historians do is we get other people's stories. So this is me telling my story instead. You're not interviewers, but essentially it's the same thing. So I will be talking about how I learned Uzbek, how I use Uzbek, and what motivates me to continue learning with some caveats. I am not the world's most brilliant Uzbek speaker. I can tell you that right away, but I can use this language in research. So let's start with me moving some things. Okay. How and when and why did I learn Uzbek? I started learning Russian way back in the Cold War in the early 1980s. I was an undergraduate at Dartmouth College, and I was very fortunate to have a really strong Russian language program at Dartmouth. Dartmouth had a method at the time they called the Roscius method, named after a famous French professor. But essentially what it meant is that you did something like 9 hours a week of your language every week. It was really intensive. Hence, I was able to learn Russian, a language that I considered quite hard and that I really struggled to learn. In the summer after my second year of college, I went to what was then called Leningrad to do a summer intensive study abroad for Russian language. And that time abroad gave me confidence that I actually could learn a language to the degree of being able to speak it comfortably and understand when people were talking with me. And that was a huge thing. It was a huge moment of transition for me to recognize that you can do the classroom stuff and the classroom stuff. Once you become immersed in a language, then maybe you have this moment of transition from knowing it in the abstract to actually being able to use it. I went to the University of Chicago, was studying for my PhD in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. And the languages that were open to me at the time were Turkish and Persian. What I really wanted to do was study Central Asia, Soviet Central Asia. But NELC didn't have any Central Asian languages, so I went with what was closest. And then in the summer of 1989, I got to come to Indiana University to do summer intensive Uzbek, first year in what was then called SWISL and is now called the Language Workshop. And there is actually a joke on this t-shirt. So this is one of those Been there, done that, got the t-shirt? I did. I got the t-shirt. We, in fact, my class designed the t-shirt. So if anybody who reads Uzbek wants to ask about that one or comment on the joke that is on the screen, on the back side of it, you're welcome. Or I can share it with you. So the textbook that we used for this class, back then, this was kind of the first time that Uzbek had been taught in the US. And Ulay Shamilalu, a professor of Turkology, had translated a textbook that had been created for Russians who went to Uzbekistan to work as agricultural specialists. It was a little textbook from the 1960s trying to teach Russians how to speak Uzbek. And Shamilalu translated the Russian part into English, and that was what we used. And so it was absolutely full of very communist terms, things that were very much about agriculture. And this particular sentence that when my class read it, we simply lost it. We thought this was the funniest sentence we had ever read in our lives, that Mahmoud Aka has only one hand, but nonetheless, every day with his giant combine, he is able to harvest 1.5 tons of cotton. Now, the interesting irony of this for me later is that I did take up a project of asking elderly people about collectivization, and I met many people who really were Mahmoud Aka. They were elderly collective farmers who had lost an arm or lost a leg during World War II. And nonetheless, they worked on the collective farm. So it was a t-shirt that came back around to me and became meaningful in a new way because of that project. I studied in this Uzbek language class at Indiana University. And then the following summer, 1990, I went to the University of Washington and did an intensive Uzbek second year there. And after that, the professor from University of Washington, Ilza Sertautis, made it possible for me to go on her exchange to Tashkent State University, where I went in 1991 to do language study for about 3 months. That was while there still was a Soviet Union. I went in April of 1991 and left in July of 1991, right before the coup happened. Okay, so next slide. Yes, next slide. There we go. So as with Russian, what enabled me to actually start speaking Uzbek in a way that was comfortable, in a way that allowed me to genuinely communicate, was going to Uzbekistan and being thrown into the situation and working, struggling to speak Uzbek all the time. One of the things that I had learned about myself in trying to learn a number of languages, there are a number of them that I read and that I don't speak. And this has something to do with my own emotions, my own emotional attraction to or dislike of a particular language. I really ran into this when I was in college. I had been taking Russian, which I loved, and so I worked hard at it. And then I took German, and I had the most off-putting instructor ever. He gave the effect of being offended if you use der when you were supposed to use dame or something like that, and he would interrupt you right away and correct you. And I developed a phobia about German. To this day, you know, I can read it a bit, but I don't have that attraction to trying to speak it. Uzbek was different for me. After having worked at, struggled with trying to learn Turkish and Persian, when I started Uzbek, I thought, this is the best language in the world. I love this language. Somehow it, because I was emotionally disposed to learn it, it was something that I was really genuinely interested in learning. It seemed much easier to me than other languages that I had tried. That also was probably the result of having taken several years of Turkish, so I already kind of got the structure of Uzbek. When I got to Uzbekistan, 1991 was a very interesting year. So there were all of these discussions going on about the importance of the Uzbek language, about Uzbek should become language of government, about Russian dominance of Central Asia as a form of colonialism. And when I would go out in public, for example, to the market, and I'd try to talk with a vendor in Uzbek, their initial response to me would be incredulity. Are you really speaking Uzbek? They would ask me this in Russian. And I would answer, and I'd have to do that for about 3 or 4 interactions before they'd switch and speak to me in Uzbek. And I had moments when vendors would, a very particular moment at Alai Bazaar, when one vendor dragged me out into the central aisle and started shouting at people all around, saying, you Russians, you've been living in Uzbekistan all this time and you don't speak Uzbek, but here is this girl from America and she speaks Uzbek. That's a lot of pressure. I don't speak Uzbek that well, and I'm not here to condemn anybody either, but there was a very strong support for speaking Uzbek at the time when I first went to Tashkent. At the same time, Tashkent was very much a Russian-speaking city, and so my challenge was to try to force myself to speak Uzbek and to work with the people who became my friends so that they would force me to speak Uzbek instead of just falling back on Russian. One of the things that helped with this actually was that love-hate relationship. I had always enjoyed Russian. I still do. I enjoy speaking Russian. But in 1991 in particular, when there was this language tension, I encountered Russian as the language of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy was crazy at that time. I was always having to jump through this hoop and that hoop and fill out this form and ask for that. And I would have to do so in Russian, and people would look at me like I was pathetically stupid for not understanding their complicated bureaucratic terms and being able to do these tasks. So there was a moment when I went to the Central Post Office, which was the only place where I could place a phone call home to the US. And to place a phone call home at the time, you had to go up to the phone call division and you had to fill out this form and turn it in, and then you had to wait, you'd have a number, and then a voice would come over the PA system that said, and I heard that and didn't have any idea what it was. And the people around me understood that it was Marianne Kamp, you need to come up and get, you're being called to the phone. And they directed me, here you go over there. And it was such an off-putting experience that I was really very much emotionally not interested in trying to speak to people in Russian. And I was very interested in trying to speak with people in Uzbek. I had the great privilege of making a whole bunch of friends right away at Tashkent State University, people who welcomed me, who invited me over for meals, who invited me to come to their hometowns. And I also had another really amazing opportunity while I was there, and that was I was invited by my mentor in Uzbekistan to come and live in her family. So my mentor in Uzbekistan, Dilarom Alimova, was one of the people who was writing on the topic that I was interested in at the time, that I was working on for my dissertation, which was about women and unveiling in Uzbekistan. So I had read something of her work before I went to Uzbekistan, and I had actually written her a letter explaining that I was coming to Uzbekistan, asking if I could meet her. The letter didn't reach her, but a message got to her somehow through one of the professors at Tashkent State University. And one day she showed up at my dorm room, introduced herself, said, I've heard about you, I want to meet you, took one look around my dorm room, and the conditions in 1991 were very rudimentary, extremely. And she said, come live with me. So I had this lovely experience of living with her family and being able to work on my Uzbek there, which really, interestingly, we would always talk about academic topics in Russian, but the daily life topics, the how to cook and this is laundry and stuff like that in Uzbek. And so that context really expanded my vocabulary and the things that I was comfortable talking about. When I went back to the US after that first visit in 1991, I realized that I needed to know a lot more about my topic in order to be successful as a researcher. When I was there in the spring of 1991, I thought I already knew that I wanted to use oral history as a method of research. And so I thought, well, I will try doing a practice interview or two. And so I sat with a group of elderly women in a home in Turkestan, another place that I had been invited to. It was great. Turkestan, Kazakhstan. And I tried to ask them a little bit about the 1920s and unveiling. And so I quickly learned the very first lesson of oral history interviewing, which is do not try to interview a group. Don't even try to interview one person when they're sitting in a group. That doesn't work. But I also learned a lot of other things, like know your topic well, have some particular questions, know what you're going to be asking about. Don't waste people's time. And so I began to work through the process of developing as an oral history interviewer, something that I really didn't have training in. When I came back to the US, I could do a lot of reading on my topic, this 1920s, the hujum, all of that, in English and in Russian. So I searched out the English language works like Gregory Massel's The Surrogate Proletariat, and using his work, I jumped off into the earlier Russian language publications and primary sources. And so in the US, I was able to find some things like Kommunistka, the journal from the 1920s, and begin to get a sense of the vocabulary, the ideas, the processes. But it's one thing to learn those things in Russian, and a very different one to learn them in Uzbek. When I was in Uzbekistan in 1991, I did manage to pick up a few things, books published by Central Asian authors, Central Asian writers, by Alimova and others about that time period. I also picked up magazines and newspapers in Uzbek. And in 1991 was this amazing sort of year for being retrospective. Everybody was talking about the past. There were all these articles about the past. And so I could read things about the 1920s in just about any magazine or newspaper. And I also could read things like this, which was one of Alimova's books on the topic, the Heralds of a New Life, which is in Uzbek. And this was really important because I needed to develop the vocabulary about events in the 1920s and about processes and about key words and phrases that people would use so that I could actually form questions for my oral history interviews that people would be able to relate to, that would take them back to that time by triggering the kinds of things that were talked about back in the 1920s. One of the other things that happened in 1991, of course, was that in addition to meeting Alimova, I met a lot of other scholars from the Institute of History, and they became deeply important to me when I went back in 1992, 1993 to do extensive dissertation research, because they helped me with two different things. And one was finding respondents who would be able to talk with me about the 1920s, and the other was finding really good sources in the libraries and in the archives. So when I was there in 92, 93, my goal was to interview elderly Uzbek women about their lives and particularly their experiences of unveiling, if they did that, back in the 1920s. So the most helpful thing that happened for me was that I had made a bunch of friends in 1991. And one of them, Ikram Nughman Hojayev, had been a student at the university studying English in 1991. So he and I would do language exchange. He'd teach me Uzbek, I'd work with him on his English. We also would play guitars together and sing songs and all kinds of things like that. And he became one of my really, really most essential partners in 92. He helped me to formulate the questions. So I could write them up in English and discuss them with him in Uzbek, and he really helped me to put them into a way that made sense as questions for my elderly respondents. He did the first few interviews with me. He set one up with one of his grandmothers in Namangan. We did this interview, and I had just come to Uzbekistan. Yes, I could speak Uzbek, but not fluently. And the kinds of questions that I was asking, I understood my questions, but I did not necessarily understand the answers that people gave me. He was at that interview with me. He would say, do you understand this, Marianne? He would explain it in different ways. He would go back over things. After the first couple of interviews, I discussed all of those interviews with him. I discussed the content. We worked on my understandings of what was being said. I recorded all of the interviews on tape. I didn't write anything while I was interviewing. And it's, for me, this is actually a really important part of oral history interviewing. We record specifically so that we're not looking down at a piece of paper while we're talking to somebody, so that we can fully engage in the conversation and fully listen to what the respondent is saying. But because I had those tapes, I could re-listen to them and kind of figure out, oh, that's what they were saying. Oh my, I should have asked about this. And listening to the earlier ones helped me then improve as an interviewer for the later ones. Other friends from the university, other friends from the Institute also set up interviews for me, accompanied me to interviews, talked with me about the substance of those interviews. And what happened over the course of the year, as I did about 32 or so interviews over the course of about 9 months, 10 months, was the magic of repetition. I was immersed in an Uzbek speaking context. I was doing these similar interviews over and over again. And the later ones are much better than the earlier ones because my understanding of what people were saying to me was so much richer. I could actually do serious follow-up questions. I could respond to the things that they were saying knowledgeably. And I could pick up on their nuances, and I could follow them into new territory. So there was a huge learning curve that went on between the early ones and the late ones. And it wasn't just because of interviewing. It was also because of being in Uzbekistan and interacting with people on all kinds of topics on an everyday basis. Okay, when I got home, then there was an entirely new way of listening, and that was called transcribing. Now, for an oral historian, if you're interviewing in your own language and people are responding in your own language, then maybe you can just leave an interview as a bunch of tapes and you quickly type up those parts that you actually need when you're going to be using that material in a publication. Or maybe you're going to turn it into a movie or something else. But that wasn't me. I am interviewing in my second language. Going back over those tapes is something that I do in order to transcribe, but it's not something that I'm going to do over and over again as I am working with the material. Fundamentally, in order to make any oral history interview into something that is usable beyond the person who carried out the interviews, you actually have to have it transcribed. And so I spent a lot of time after I came back listening to these tapes, slowly, transcribing them. Transcribing in a language that is your second language is harder than doing it in your first language. I got better at this. I became somebody who could actually type fairly fast in Uzbek, surprisingly. I don't think I'm that person anymore. But this was a slow and agonizing process, but it was also extremely good for my knowledge of Uzbek because I had to look up all sorts of phrases and things that people had been saying that I wasn't sure what they were saying. It expanded my vocabulary, it expanded my knowledge of phraseology, and it really expanded my understanding of how people speak as opposed to the formal language that is used in writing. So there's an example of one of my laborious transcripts. At the same time, it was also important to keep on engaging with materials from the time. And so while I was in Uzbekistan, I had collected all kinds of things that were published in the 1920s. I was specifically interested more than anything else in this journal, Yangiol, which was the women's magazine in Uzbekistan that it celebrated the hujum. It was all about, hey, women, you got to get out there and unveil. But as I was reading these texts, I would notice the kinds of phrases and the kinds of words and the kinds of expressions and ideas that I was also finding in my transcripts. When talking about the 1920s, elderly people had not updated their vocabulary. They still talked about it in the same way that they would have done in the 1920s. And there's a huge correspondence between the texts from the time and their words. So all of that attention then to the details of exactly what they were saying and how it corresponds to other things from the 1920s and the kinds of phrases drew my attention to many, many, many specifics that kind of create insight into a worldview. And, you know, we could start with the idea that when we're talking about this topic in Russian, the women's division of the Communist Party spoke of unveiling. Unveiling is not a term in Uzbek. There's not even a word that is called veil. There is hijab, which is different than veil. But when women talked about what they were doing in the 1920s, they were super specific about a specific garment that they wore, the paranje, and what they were doing was paranje tashlash. They were throwing off the paranje, or they were uncovering, which is what's happening in this photo where a woman is removing the chachvan from her face. And those are the very specific terms that show up in the 1920s documents and in the interviews that women did with me. Is that important? It becomes important in a certain way, you know, for an interpretation of how people understood their own actions and what they thought was the significance of those actions. Of course, all of that took lots of reliance on essential tools. The Uzbek Tilining Izaklı Lugati was my go-to because and nowadays I can be kind of a cheater a lot of times and I'll just Google a term, but it's not the same as looking it up in the Izaklı Lugat, because the Izaklı Lugat gives me sample phrases, examples of the way that a certain word or verb or whatever is used. It was incredibly important for deciphering the interviews, the nuances of speech that women had been using in these interviews. So I'll move on to the more recent project that I did. No, this one isn't recent either. This is early 2000s. I'm on to a different one now. But the next time I did a project, rather than doing it simply by myself, I had the great good fortune of getting grants and having partners, Russell Zanka, the anthropologist, and Ilyar Karimov, historian, and working with a collective of researchers in Tashkent who called themselves at the time the Young Scholars Association. Our project that Russell and I designed was oral histories of collectivization of agriculture in Uzbekistan. Because we were working with this collective, it was possible to do a much bigger scale project. We carried out interviews in 7 different provinces, and there were 120 interviews. I was certainly not there at all of those. Most of the interviews were done by my colleagues from the Young Scholars Association. They were fluent Uzbek speakers. They also, you know, spoke any other languages that they needed. Some Kazakh in some cases, and Tajik in a few cases, and the Khwarezmian dialect, which is very different from the rest. But so they were an amazingly talented bunch. The same things were necessary with that project as with the earlier project, steeping myself in the language of the time. So I read the English language scholarship on collectivization in the Soviet Union, of course, the Russian language scholarship on collectivization in Uzbekistan, so that I could really get a sense of what were the events and what were the campaigns and the terms and all of that. And I spent a lot of time in the archives, both in Moscow and in Uzbekistan, finding archival records and really looking for the ones that appear in Uzbek. So most of the 1930s archival documents in Uzbekistan, at least in the Central Archive, are in Russian, but there's a lot of material in Uzbek too. Here are a couple of documents in 1930s Latin alphabet Uzbek. And these are super important, once again, for getting the terms right, for being able to ask the relevant questions, the kind of questions that will spark the memories of the people whom I was trying to ask. So here are a few photos from interviews that we did in different places in Uzbekistan. And you can see in one of them, I'm over here, and my colleagues from the Young Scholars Association are over on this side, and our interviewee is in between us. This was a really wonderful experience for me working in this collective, because I wasn't just listening to myself and my own questions and the answers from one respondent. Instead, we as a group worked on the questionnaire together. My colleagues from Uzbekistan really improved the questions very much, trying to put them into ways that make sense in Uzbekistan. My partners in Uzbekistan, did the work of recording, audio and video recording, and in general, they were leading we would have one interviewer lead the questions. So in this case, it was Kamal Kalanov sitting over there opposite me, and other interviewers could throw in a question now and then. I would do that occasionally. There were some interviews that I did by myself or with Russell, but in general, we had more than one person in the room, and that enriched the interviews a lot, because it meant that different people in the room would be paying attention to different things, following up in specific ways. And it also meant for me that I could really concentrate on listening to the things that our respondent was saying, and interjecting once in a while for one or two questions, rather than feeling like I'm on the spot all the time. So, as I said, working with this group was a wonderful thing. They worked, we tested the questionnaire, we had audio and video recordings, and most importantly for me, the research group did professional transcripts. Why is that important? It meant that I have these. I had their professional transcript. I could do a translation into English based on a written document rather than by listening and struggling and transcribing before translating. So this was far more efficient from my point of view, and it was also far more accurate. I know that my Uzbek speaking colleagues doing a transcript of an Uzbek interview are inherently, necessarily way better than I am at transcribing an interview. One, they're faster, but two, they have the native knowledge of the language. I don't. And so there are many things that I am just going to get wrong. But this made it possible then for me to simply work with the transcripts and do translations in this time. So what about all of this? Listening, and listening to people talk, trying to find the right terms, trying to find ways to engage in a conversation that goes back decades and that pulls out people's memories. For me, this has been a wonderful way to continue to engage with learning Uzbek. What actually motivates me to learn? I have to tell you, once again, I'm not a language genius. I know there are a lot of speakers of Uzbek who are way better than I am, and younger American colleagues who are in this field who are just brilliant, who leave me amazed when they open their mouths. I'm not that person, and I never will be. I am motivated to learn by a number of things, partly by friendship, partly by my emotional connection with people in Uzbekistan. I'm also motivated by trying to dig into a specific question. So anytime I develop a new project, that is what motivates me to get into the published material and into, listening and watching film and whatever else it is that will expand my vocabulary, that will enable me to pick up the kinds of phrases and nuances and interpretations from that time that then allow me to listen to somebody's interview and understand what they're saying. So currently I'm onto a new project, and this one is about 1991 in Central Asia. Again, it's a collaborative project, so asking people about how the collapse of the Soviet Union and the creation of independence reshaped their own lives, their work lives, their political attitudes, and many, many other things. So this is going to push me again into another vocabulary and another way of engaging with Uzbek language. So I think, yes. So for me to learn a language, I have to need to use that language. And oral history allows me to use language in a really active way, forces me to make this a living language for myself, even though that can be a very hard thing to do when I'm not a native speaker. So I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions. And should I unshare? I think I'll unshare. And if you want to see any of those slides again, I'm happy to show them.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kemp. For questions, if people would like to just unmute and come over the mic, feel free to ask your question that way. We will also monitor the chat if people have questions there. And it looks like Tim has a question.
Hi, Tim.
Hello, thank you for this. And one of the reasons I'm here, I'm actually in Tbilisi, Georgia, as usual, and it's really late at night. But as some of the people here know, we're going to do a workshop in the Summer Slavic Research Laboratory on this topic of language competencies in research. So I have two questions. I'll try to keep them as brief as possible. And one of those is, one of the reasons we wanted to do a workshop on this topic is that there's been a lot of reflection, especially in anthropology and ethnography, about language competency and the authority of the scholar, and especially sort of mythologization of language ability, but also because of that, not wanting to talk about things like using interpreters or using digital translation and things like that. So as one question, it seems to me that one really good solution to the problem of how you deal with language learning is working with a collective that you described. And I wondered, I think that would be very much accepted in oral history. I wonder, do you get pushback from anthropology, ethnography for that, for not being the individualist and going out and doing everything yourself, but working with translators? And the second question is, in the current circumstances with decentering the curriculum and so forth, and also finding a lot of people who are themselves being decentered and finding themselves not being able to do research in the places they were before and having to go somewhere else, and maybe having to really quickly learn a new language or be in a situation where they only know the imperial language and want to do research and continue research. Uzbekistan, and I'm not an expert on this, but I understand that there was a long period when it was actually very difficult to go and do field research after Andijan and until the Uzbek Spring of more recent years. So I wonder if you've had that sort of experience yourself of thinking about or doing research in places where you don't have the opportunity to spend so much time really being able to learn the language so well. So those are my two questions. I hope they're clear.
Yeah, so the first question, working with a collective has been fantastic, as I explained. I don't do it so that other people interpret for me. I do speak Uzbek and I do listen in Uzbek and so forth, but I know that my colleagues are better. I do, and so I'm super fortunate to be able to rely on them in so many ways. And I think, so would I try this for languages that I really don't speak and where I genuinely need an interpreter? Actually, in our project, we did have several interviews that were in Tajik. I wasn't actually present for either of those, and based on the fact that I studied Persian and studied Tajik, I actually could read the transcript and understand it, not as well as I can do with Uzbek, but working with a friend. And yet that is, frankly, then we get into that, how well do I need to know this in order to really work with this material? And to what extent is it, in any case, something, especially when I'm doing these collaborations, where I'm really relying on the knowledge of my colleagues from Uzbekistan anyway, and I'm struggling to get through how I, my own understanding of what it is. For me, myself, there are limits to what I would do. If I were interviewing only in Russian, I would probably try to orient my project toward the kinds of topics that I think can be adequately addressed by my Central Asian interlocutors, where speaking Russian is comfortable on that topic. Agricultural change in Uzbekistan in the 1930s was not one of those topics, right? That was, but for 1991, I might do some of these interviews in Russian because of the time and the kind of people that I will be talking with. Do I get pushback from others on that? I've never had any, but I don't hang out with anthropologists either too much. So I'm an oral historian. I'm like, no, I hang out with historians. So did I answer both of your questions? No, the decentering one. And the place, what happens when we can't really do research in the place that we'd love to be. Yeah, so I was very fortunate that we did this massive number of oral history interviews at a moment when it could still be done. We finished them in 2004. It was such a giant body of material that I have been working with it for the last 16 years. I'm also very slow. I'm just like the world's slowest scholar, I think. But so I was fortunate because after that, I couldn't go and do research in Uzbekistan. I could visit Uzbekistan. I could go as a tourist, but I couldn't do any serious research until after Karimov passed away. And since then, it's become obviously more possible. Other scholars have gone. I haven't gone and spent extensive time there, and I diverted toward more text-based scholarship, things where, I have these publications, I have these documents that I collected way back when, or I also worked with colleagues in Uzbekistan, asking them to provide me with copies of this, that, and the other thing. And it is possible to work with facilitators who can go to archives and collect documents and share them with you. So I had to work on other methods for doing research. And I think that's one of the things that unfortunately comes up among people who, I may think of this as unique to the former Soviet Union. It's probably not. It's probably something that happens in many places where access to being able to do research suddenly disappears, and we have to reinvent and rethink and try some other things. And so I don't have any solutions. That's just what I have done.
Thank you. And then we have a question in the chat, which is, are you comfortable reading Uzbek in Latin script? And we do have some questions that people submitted ahead of time, and that goes along with these, which is, could you talk a little bit more about orthographical changes to Uzbek language and maybe how you navigate that within your research?
So I'm more comfortable reading Uzbek in Arabic script than in Latin, only because Latin is annoying. There are a lot of orthography changes so that the alphabet itself keeps changing and getting some new letters. And so you have to be really attentive and think about, okay, what year are we in here? What is this letter doing right now? And for me, there's a lot of kind of saying it out loud and going, is it this? Is it that? So I'm frankly way more, the reformed Uzbek of the 1920s is more consistent and therefore kind of easier to read than the Latin Uzbek of the 1930s. I'm most comfortable with Cyrillic Uzbek and with contemporary Latin Uzbek, just because I've worked with them so much. But the orthographic changes are, they're annoying, but learning an alphabet really is small potatoes compared to learning a language, right? And so it's not that hard to do. I was able to adapt to Arabic script Uzbek, though, largely because I studied Persian for 2 years and then had a year of Ottoman and actually did some Chagatai and so forth. So that wasn't so hard. Chris Ford. Hey, how are you? I'm just going to call people out because there are these brilliant speakers of Uzbek, and Chris is one of them. So of Uzbek people who have learned Uzbek as foreign speakers. Of course, not to say anything about none of us is ever going to be a native speaker. But hey, Chris, got any questions, comments?
I did, yeah. Sorry, I just had to get away from a spot where the dog was barking. Yeah, I was curious. So you talked about the 1990s being a really unique time to learn Uzbek and get immersed in it. I'm wondering how you think a student now, what would be different about, like, what are the opportunities available to them? What are the social circles that they might get involved in? How do they differ from the 90s?
So I think Uzbekistan today is so different than it was in the 1990s. And one of the things that has happened is, at least for an awful lot of youth in Uzbekistan, there have been so much improvement in the ability to study foreign languages and to speak other things. And so when I was in Uzbekistan, speakers of English were extremely hard to find. And there were just, a small group at the university, and nobody else ever tried speaking English with me. They would speak Russian, but not English. But now when you go to Uzbekistan, knowledge of English is incredibly pervasive. And so there's, especially for an American going there, there's this lazy default where one can just say, well, I'll just talk with you in English instead of forcing yourself to speak Uzbek. And one of the things that I noticed in the late 90s, this was because of the de-Russification of Uzbekistan, schools were kind of de-Russified. There wasn't Russian being taught normally outside of big cities. I went to a village with Russell Zanka in 2001 to do interviews, and the people who were under age 25 really didn't speak Russian at all. They spoke only Uzbek. And so it was a super Uzbek speaking environment when I was doing those collectivization oral history interviews. And that, that Russian has made a comeback, other foreign languages have made a comeback. And so somebody who's going and wants to really be immersed and speak Uzbek is going to have to choose that much more consciously than I had to choose it. It was default when I was there. And now it's a matter of going and finding the people who are willing to spend their time with a pathetic speaker like me and allow me to stumble through, rather than saying, okay, let's switch to English because it would be so much easier for you. PB Kai, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you, Marianne. This is a fascinating story. And I just did a quick comment from an overall language learning and teaching point of view, and then a quick introspection question that you may or may not have an answer to. It was great. You actually reiterated those points about paying attention to the genre and repetitive context, interactional practice. And of course, you said it got easier and the learning exponentially grew. It's because of your vocabulary, but also because the genre was the same, or the practice was the same as an oral interview. And there's a lot of benefit in doing that repetitive, even with you had different stories, right? And you had different, although your questions were similar, but still the framework helps so much. Then you made another point, intertextuality. So that is the other, you have the same topic, but in different texts, and also intermodality. You get the same content by listening, by reading, by speaking about it, by writing about it. That all builds. And then, of course, transcription. Right, so this is something that learners themselves can do. Listen to your textbook dialogues and transcribe them, and it helps. So that was all fascinating. But what I was wondering, you mentioned when you did very intensive listening, right, and also maybe transcription, but especially listening. Did you ever notice that your speaking improved as well?
Yes.
Or like your oral fluency, and not necessarily in the interview context, but overall, did it kind of activate that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, it's very fun to listen to the early interviews. I'm like, wow, I can't even ask a question. I stumble over pronunciation and I can't find the right way around this. And by the later interviews, it's like, this is a conversation.
Right.
And so, yeah, I could see my own improvement. But it was so much about the repetition and the fact that in each of these cases, whenever I do one of these projects, there is a thematic coherence to the vocabulary that I'm picking up. So listen, I can talk farming like crazy, but move me over to a slightly different topic like industrialization, forget it. I have no vocabulary, I can't do it at all. So I'm well aware that intertextuality and the repetition and the thematics and the genre all really are what boost my language learning. And if I were a much more dedicated person who was younger and had a more flexible brain, and I applied that on a much more regular basis to all sorts of things, I would be such a brilliant Uzbek speaker, but I'm not.
Well, but basically, we shouldn't be taking away from your advice of using the Teams and of course native speaker resource and all of that. I didn't get the sense that you felt that your experience doing that on your own imperfectly was somehow a wasted time.
No, not at all. Not at
because
all.
I think there's also doing a transcribing yourself, even being imperfect, helps you understand the material.
Absolutely, yeah. It does. It's just very painful.
I know. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. So I'll ask a question that someone submitted ahead of time, which is you've talked about working in collectives and working with other scholars. So someone was wondering, what are your suggestions for acknowledging translators, interlocutors, and scholars who you've worked with while doing your oral history research? And they've specified not limited to, but especially for scholars who might be looking to break into Western academia.
Right. So the collective project that I was able to do in the early 2000s, obviously I have the names of everybody who was involved in that, and they are all going to be included in the book, and so they will be acknowledged in that way. We did a conference, a kind of wrap-up conference at the History Institute in Tashkent, where participants in the project were, some of them presented their own research based on the project, and I presented mine, and so we were able to do that kind of prominence for some of the participants. Some of the collaborators that I worked with really saw this as far as I can tell from the time, as a paid way of being involved in research that was useful to them, but it wasn't particularly their interest. There were several who were involved in the project who really found the material, the kinds of responses that that the respondents were giving, to work with the kinds of questions that they were interested in. And so in particular, Shahnaza Madayeva, one of them, used some of the materials in her own publications and in her own future work, which is in a completely different field. It's in philosophy and kind of social ethics and stuff like that. So at the time, I really tried to emphasize that I wanted to make that available to anybody if they wanted to work with me on something, develop it on their own. She was the one who really followed through on that. This time in the 1991 project, we're developing it in a much more collaborative from the start way. So my colleagues in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, we have worked together on coming up with the entire concept, on creating the rafts of this, that, and the other thing, on figuring out what angles we want to take on it. And so I'm trying this time to really build in, how do we make this a project where we can use the kinds of resources that I can bring to this, in a way that gives everybody the same opportunity to publish and to make their work known and to engage in something that is prominent and create something that is lasting. And that, in my ideal world, is how this happens. But I haven't found the ideal pot of money to make that happen. And so that's the limitation. And yet it also is something that we collectively are working on and trying to figure out, okay, you come up with this here, we come up with this there, and maybe we can make this work anyway. So I'm still struggling with the ways that we make partnerships across these international boundaries vital, non-hierarchical, driven by common interest rather than just by me, the wealthy and well-positioned, relatively American researcher. And I think this is our ongoing struggle in the field. How do we do that?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kemp. This was a wonderful speech, and I know people were very excited to hear about your journey with language learning. I'd also like to thank Kathleen Evans for helping us facilitate this series. And then thank you to everyone else for coming today and for your great questions and participation. Our next and final installment for this year in the series will be a conversation on Uyghur language learning. So please do keep a lookout for that if you're interested in attending. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody, for your attention.